Hello and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this programme today, we'll be discussing the EU's latest plans to impose economic sanctions upon Israel on goods and services produced in Judea and Samaria, which are the biblical heartland of Israel, including the Golan Heights and also in East Jerusalem. We'll be asking how should Israel respond to this latest EU directive? And more importantly, as Christians, how should we respond to these harsh economic measures being imposed upon Israel by the European Union? To discuss this issue of the EU's proposal to bring economic sanctions upon Israel on goods and services produced in Judea and Samaria, the Golan Heights, and also in East Jerusalem, I'm joined by Zalmi Unsdorfer, from the chairman of Likud, Herut, and also our good friend Robin Benson from Christian Friends of Israel. Gentlemen, it's great to have you on this programme. Now, it's been a couple of weeks since the EU has actually decided to implement this policy of introducing economic sanctions upon Israel, which, if they are carried out, would mean that Israel could lose somewhere in the region of £260 million. Zalmi, what do you make of this decision by the EU to actually impose economic sanctions upon Israel at this time?
My first and abiding reaction is it's pure anti-Semitism. Natan Sharansky defined in a unique way anti-Semitism, where it presents itself in antagonism against Israel by the 3D formula: delegitimization, demonization, and double standards. And we are seeing this from the EU manifestly plain in this announcement. I mean, I personally could look at this from three standpoints. I could look at it as an EU taxpayer, which I am, and I could say that it is a gross abuse of taxpayers' funds for what looks to be a racial agenda and all the resources that go with it. I could look at it as a Jew and say that my only state, the only Jewish state on the globe, is being singled out in this way. But I could also look at this as the son of a Holocaust survivor. And my father wore a yellow star in the camp to label him as a Jew, and the EU is now labeling Jewish food in the supermarkets. So that's what I make of it.
And Robin, and I know we did a programme this week on Behind the Headlines where we actually discussed a lot of this. Is why on the Middle East Report I wanted to go more into this issue of really what the EU's proposal to in place economic sanctions upon Israel beyond the Green Line, which is effectively Judea and Samaria, which is the biblical heartland of Israel, the Golan Heights, which is famous for its wine and its winery, and also East Jerusalem as well. I mean, what do you make of this EU proposal?
I think, we were discussing this earlier before we came on air, and I think the EU is just playing out something that has been part and parcel of its ongoing processes for several years, in the sense that it's actually trying to protect itself from attack from outside forces by playing into this stream that Zalmi has mentioned of this worldwide process of delegitimizing and demonizing Israel. And I mean, it beggars belief in many respects, because it counteracts so much of what the EU is supposed to stand for. And I'm sure we'll get on to discussing some of these aspects as the program unfolds. But it's not doing itself any favors in doing this. It's undermining its authority as far as being a player, in inverted commas, in the ongoing discussions that they're trying to get off the ground to resurrect the peace process. And as some of the material that we've all looked through prior to coming on the program points out, it's actually counteracting or countermanding international law and some of the decisions that are part and parcel of this document that has been handed out by the EU Commission.
Yeah, and we've got a news clip to go to now that's entitled EU West Bank ban. EU moves to isolate Israeli settlements that strains Brussels Jerusalem ties.
In a move which is seen as a disproportionate attack on the Jewish state, the European Commission has issued a directive forbidding all 28 member countries from having dealings with Jewish communities or companies operating outside of the Green Line.
The Foreign Affairs Council at the end of last year, in December, underlined the importance of limiting the application of agreements with Israel to the territory of Israel that is recognized by the European Union. And specifically, the Council conclusions say that all agreements between the State of Israel and the EU must explicitly indicate their inapplicability to the territories occupied by Israel in 1967.
Tell me why you are upset.
For different reasons. First of all, the peace negotiation have to happen between two parts, the Israeli and the Palestinian, and they have to decide together the border of the future Palestinian state. It's not up to the European Commission to do it unilaterally. And with those guidelines, it seems that the European Commission decide that the borders will be based on the Green Line, which again, it's not up to the European Commission to decide those borders. Besides that, when you see globally the region, in the north you have a bloody civil war in Syria, which is now spreading to Lebanon. On the west, there is those riots which are shaking all Egypt today, which is a very unstable country. And on the east, above all, you have Iran, who is coming very close to the nuclear weapon. And in all this context, the only move which European Commission seems to be focused on is to introduce what appears to be a shameful boycott against the Israeli state, which is the only democratic country in the region which share the same Western European values. So it's a nonsense.
What's the European Jewish Congress's reaction to this?
Well, there are two things that we should say about this. Firstly, it's not new. It basically reinvigorates a policy which they brought forward in 2009, so it's not new. Secondly, we find it very worrying because at a time when the peace talks are being relaunched now under the sponsorship of the United States and with the support of the Quartet, we'd be looking for confidence-building measures from the European Union to start already trying to second-guess what the result of these negotiations is going to be when there is no agreement at all on what the final status will be for those areas. We regard as a very negative statement from the EU, and also puts into question their participation in these peace talks.
So you think that it's misguided and even damaging?
It's misguided and damaging, particularly at a time when we need the confidence-building measures, absolutely.
The European Commission has been asked to explain the reasons for this damaging decision, which is seen as pushing peace farther away than bringing it closer.
Welcome back to the Middle East report. Zalmi, according to my notes here, that the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Baroness Catherine Ashton, has proposed in terms of ending EU funding and cooperation, the granting of scholarships, research grants and prizes to Israeli entities in Judea and Samaria, Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, and that this boycott could actually cost Israel the sum of anywhere between £260 million. Can you tell us something more about this proposal and what it actually entails for Israel?
Well, I think you've got to laugh at the idea that Europe is going to give prizes and scholarships to Israel. I mean, that's almost laughable. I mean, we don't need grants from the EU. Israel has more venture capital flowing into the country than it can possibly handle. It is the number one, behind the United States, center of advancement. Microsoft have got more staff per capita in Israel than in any other country in the world. It's awash with that money. We don't need those grants and prizes from Europe. Forget about it. I mean, my 82-year-old mother still receives German war reparations every month. She's entitled to that because of an obscene period of European history with the Jews. Mm-hmm. And this kind of move by the EU only strengthens those who want to repeat that egregious history. That's the way I see it.
Mm. Can I just ask a question, though? Does that not nevertheless also affect Arab students who maybe at Ariel University who are getting some sort of... Is it possible that they're getting grant funding out of the EU? And is there a possibility that actually the EU is shooting itself in the foot by making statements like this because they'll then be forced to cut off the grant aid to these students? Is that a likely scenario?
Very much so. In the same way as the labeling campaign will certainly cost vast amounts of Palestinian jobs. Palestinians in the West Bank are employed in a multitude of agricultural and other businesses in the West Bank. They're thriving. They don't want this labeling business. Yeah. It's the Abbas people and the Hamas people and the Hezbollah people that want this kind of thing going on. And yes, it shoots itself in the foot in terms of jobs and grants down the line. You can't have this perfectly targeted against Israelis without affecting collateral damage to the Palestinians.
Yes, yeah.
No, absolutely. And talking about this boycott, the people it's going to suffer the most are going to be Palestinian workers. Yeah. Because we know that so many of the Jewish farms and settlements, they employ so many Palestinian workers to actually come and work on the land and to work on the Israeli wine and what have you, that if there's a boycott, they're the ones that are going to suffer the most. But also this proposal has implications, doesn't it, for the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, that the EU would actually consider being in East Jerusalem. So what are the implications for the university, which is a world-renowned established university, which I attended for some months in the summer of '96, and it's very troubling that the EU should do this at this time.
Well, I think there's much worse in what's not said, because you've had about 3 question marks so far in that statement alone. And I think this directive is designed to be sufficiently ambiguous so that apparatchiks working in the EU Commission and in their satellite offices in Israel and in other countries to be able to interpret these things on their own, depending on their particular bias and their particular hatred of Israel. I think that's a very dangerous situation. Yeah. It's also as unlawful as the move itself.
Exactly. And Robin, we see that time and time again that the Middle East, when it comes to the Middle East, the EU and certainly Baroness Ashton's office are more concerned with Jewish farmers and the expansion of Jewish homes in the biblical heartland of Israel than they are about the threat of a nuclear Iran, the rise of Islamic extremism in the Middle East, the civil war in Syria, and yet the EU places so much diplomatic emphasis on settlements. Why is it, do you think, that the EU in particular single out Jewish settlers more than any other issue in the Middle East?
Well, I have to, in some sense, I said it to Zalmi that I think part of the problem is the EU picked up on some of Israeli left-wing politicians and their slamming of the so-called settler movement, and that fed into then the EU's ability to make this a bigger issue than it actually is. I mean, we were talking about it before we came on air. The Middle East is falling apart. We're now up to somewhere in the region of 120,000 Syrians. I mean, I think actually that's a conservative estimate because there are no observers in there. So who actually knows what the total number is? Who've been slaughtered by both sides in this conflict going on for over 2 years. We were talking about this on Monday. Over 1.5 million refugees, either internally or out of the country, creating extra pressures on Iraq, on Jordan, on Lebanon, Egypt, potentially heading towards possible civil war between these two major factions. Lebanon verging on it as well. Iraq, where last month I think it was over 700 people were slaughtered in suicide bombing attacks or vehicle bombing attacks. And what does the EU concentrate on? People trying to create new communities and give employment to both Arabs and Jews within these new communities, as you said at the beginning, in the biblical heartland of Israel. It just beggars belief. I mean, there was a piece on one of our major news broadcasters last week about the EcoStream factory, which is in the so-called West Bank in Judea and Samaria. Half the workforce are Arab, half are Jews. And we have this problem down in the EcoStream shop in Brighton. Between 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock every Saturday, there's an anti-EcoStream protest, a boycott movement protest. If that firm has to relocate in order to financially survive out of the West Bank, then that half of the workforce will lose their job. And it's reckoned that there are thousands of Palestinian Arabs will lose their jobs if this is implemented. And yet the EU, the UN, even the United States are all making great noise about wanting to support the Palestinian Arabs, wanting to create this viable state. And what they're doing is undermining the economy and putting people on the dole. It makes no, as we've said before, you and I in discussion, Simon, it makes absolutely no rational sense as to this line of behaviour.
Yeah. And when you see anything that makes no rational sense,
yes,
there's usually bigotry at the heart of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is really what it's about.
Yeah.
But Zalmi, why in particular have the Jewish settlements? I mean, before Obama came into power, the idea that Jewish homes in Jerusalem, for example, would be called in occupied territory. We've seen the emergence now of Israeli-occupied East Jerusalem. And anyone who goes to Jerusalem, I know that you have a home in Jerusalem. It's a fantastic city. You know, you see it functions as one city between the Jewish neighborhood of New Jerusalem and East Jerusalem, which is where the Arabs are. They share the same light rail. It's an integrated city. And how can you possibly divide Jerusalem? So why is the EU singling out Jewish settlements? And why is the world singling out Jewish settlements as the biggest problem, an obstacle to peace in the Middle East?
Well, we don't occupy East Jerusalem. We don't.
Absolutely.
We don't occupy it. We don't want to live there. You know, but the Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem are jumping over each other, trying to get Israeli citizenship because they do not want to live under a Palestinian state. They've voted with their feet and they've voted with their queues outside those offices. Of course, Jerusalem functions extremely well, and frankly, if it's not broke, don't fix it. It's, you know, I'm in Israel, you know, many times in the year, and I go into the territories, I go into Judea and Samaria, I go to Hebron, I go to the Golan Heights, and frankly, I mean, the Golan Heights is an interesting thing that the EU has mentioned, the Golan Heights. There's no Palestinians in the Golan Heights. That's not a Palestinian issue. What are they now trying to protect Mr. Assad's territory? I mean, this is something which is fed into the EU by those people with a very seriously leftist, anti-Jewish political agenda, or not even political, it's a racial agenda. And they peddle this through. What really is, let's face it, the EU is mainly an unelected body. The Mrs. Ashton has not been elected. Mr. Van Rompuy is not elected. In fact, the EU is the biggest NGO on the planet, and it is being fed by all these other NGOs, with all of whom have got a political bent. And the most popular political bent at the moment is Bash Israel.
Which is a shame. I'm sure the EU's got more important things to worry about right now, including its financial mess that it's in.
Yes.
We've got a clip to go to now that says Israel slams EU for financial terror attack.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has slammed the European Union for barring EU member states from cooperating with Jewish settlements in the West Bank, Golan Heights, and East Jerusalem. Netanyahu said that as Prime Minister, he won't accept any foreign diktats about Israeli borders, and added that this matter can only be solved through direct Israeli-Palestinian negotiation. Economics and Trade Minister Naftali Bennett called the EU decision a financial terror attack, and added that the EU will now probably take a back seat at the ongoing peace process. The new directive bans EU nations from sending grant money to Israeli universities and private companies that operate in the West Bank, Golan Heights, and East Jerusalem, in effect cutting them off from millions of euros annually.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report. Zalmi, we saw in that clip really the proposal that the EU wants to bring about. But surely this actually goes to something much deeper than to actually bring about economic sanctions against Israel, that actually the EU is actually in breach of international law, they're in breach of UN Resolution 242, certainly in breach of the Oslo Accords that were signed between the Israelis and the Palestinians in '93, in which in those agreements it talks about how the two sides would negotiate a final settlement. So why is the EU actually breaching international law by imposing its own view upon Israel and actually not recognizing Israel beyond the Green Line, as it were, the 1949 armistice lines, which is exactly what they are, an armistice lines after Israel's War of Independence?
Well, this unelected NGO, the EU, is seeking simply and clearly to impose a peace settlement or impose borders on Israel. You know, the 67 borders are not borders. They are the 1949 armistice lines. They were never considered to be as borders, and that is another misnomer. They are simply outdoing the UN at its own game. The UN has tried to impose this, and they got stymied as a result of United States veto powers. But there's no United States veto power on the EU, and therefore the EU is looking very much to flex its muscles and basically punch above its weight. And it's a lightweight. It really is. It's really shot itself in the foot. It looks very silly right now, and it's not surprising that the Israeli government and the embassies are not speaking about this too much, because I think that they see the EU apparatchiks have got up a tree and they need to come down. And the less said about it in political circles, I think the better right now.
And we've got a clip to go to now that looks at the influence of the boycotts, divestments and sanction campaign is actually having on EU policy towards Israel. We're now joined on the phone by Lenny Ben David, who is the Communications Director for NGO Monitor. Lenny, welcome to the Middle East Report. I know that you're in Jerusalem.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Can you tell us, what do you make of this latest EU sanctions against Israeli goods and services produced in Judea and Samaria, East Jerusalem, including the Golan Heights? And why has the EU decided to pursue this very, very harsh economic policies against Israel at this time?
Let's start with the policy of some type of discrimination against Israeli industries and companies. It's directed at companies that are over the Green Line, over the 1949 armistice line that ended the war between Israel and the Arab states. And it was just an armistice line where the army stopped. It wasn't an official border. It was never recognized as an official border. In the territories in the West Bank, also known as Judea and Samaria, were territories that were not state-owned. The Jordanians controlled it, but I think only Britain was the sole country that recognized it. And when Jordan attacked Israel, Israel had the right to retaliate and took over the territory. Today, Jordan no longer has any claims. So the area is considered certainly up for negotiations, but the Europeans and the United Nations have declared that Israelis living there for 40 years is an illegal act, not only in the West Bank, but also in new neighborhoods in Jerusalem and, as you mentioned, the Golan Heights. And these are certainly territories that are negotiable, but the Europeans, and I'm afraid the Great Britain as well, have declared unilaterally that this is the solution, that Israel has no right over this territory, before we go into negotiations. So it raises the question, by the way, why should the Palestinians even enter negotiations when apparently the European Union is doing it for them? By declaring anything that is made over this green line, over this armistice line, should be boycotted. Why is it so harsh? I suspect that the media is reporting it as harsher than it is, and I would suspect that when we see it enacted, it won't be as harsh. I certainly hope so. The Palestinians have some very good friends who have been lobbying European governments, friends who we call NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that promote the Palestinian case and are frequently attacking Israel. Some of these are Arab or pro-Arab organizations. Others are humanitarian organizations. And I'm sorry to say, in some cases, it is we see this happening by church organizations.
And Lenny, how is the Israeli government responding to this? Because we tried to get a statement from the Israel's representatives to the European Union, and they don't want to comment on this at this time. So how is the government responding to this, and how should the Israeli government respond to this latest EU proposal of economic sanctions on Israeli goods and services?
Excellent questions. I suspect that the Israeli government, and from those who I've spoken to, also hope that when the ultimate decision is made, and it's not going to be enacted at least until 2014, it will be a different outcome than what some of the press are declaring, that this is a major earthquake. And so we will see negotiations taking place. It was unfortunate that there were virtually no negotiations before this was sprung. And it probably hurts the peace process by unilaterally declaring such actions, by promoting a solution or by dictating a solution before going into negotiations. It doesn't help. And then most ironically, who is going to be hurt tremendously by this action if it's enacted will be Palestinian workers on the West Bank. There are thousands, probably tens of thousands of Palestinians who work in companies that are owned by Jews or work in communities known by some as settlements, and they would find themselves out of work if a canning plant or SodaStream, a famous company, is boycotted because it has a production line on the West Bank. Then hundreds of Arabs will be put out of work as well. So what's going to happen? SodaStream will move 2 miles inside Israel, the old Israel border, and the Palestinians will not be able to work there. So there is some irony in here that more people and organizations and some governments are more interested in bashing at Israel rather than helping to promote a peace process.
And Lenny, for example, I just want to quote something to you. This is a spokesman by Zaid Sharubi, who's a spokesman for the BDS movement. I'd like to know your comments on this one. Said, regardless of the scope and the reach of these European measures, they are already sending strong signals around Europe and the world at large that the era of sanctions against Israel has started. These guidelines will undoubtedly erode Israel's standing in international public opinion and encourage European and other citizens to seriously consider joining the fast-growing BDS movement for Palestinian freedom, justice and equality. The S in BDS is becoming more realistic as a result.
We have not seen it happen yet. I'll add that we just saw a singer from the Animals appear in Israel despite attempts by the BDS groups, and we've got other singers coming in from England despite the attempts by BDS movement to boycott Israel. Getting back to a bigger issue, however, and that is these boycotts and sanctions are not working. They can claim victory here or there, but in effect, companies will still continue to buy Israeli products, will still want Israeli high-tech programming. There is still a great deal of interest in Israeli produce and Israeli products. And so BDS will claim here or there that they stopped the store from selling a Dead Sea salt. But for every store that stops such an effort, there are probably 10 that open up such an effort. And there are friends of Israel around the world who will say, instead of a boycott, we're going to have a boycott. An example that comes to mind was a store in Canada where before Passover there was an attempted boycott at Israeli wines, and the store sold out in Israeli wines in record time because people said, we support Israel. And so boycotts don't tend to work. The inbred hypocrisy of no such BDS movement against Syria or against Egyptian cotton at a time when the Egyptian army is firing at demonstrators is not only ironic, it's hypocritical. And I would welcome the BDS movement to be concerned about the 100,000 dead and hundreds of thousands wounded in Syria, but I have not heard a single word. And the BDS movement that launches flotillas to Gaza, I'd be more interested in flotillas to Syria or to Egypt, where truly populations are suffering. There was an ironic story that was covered this week that several truckloads of potatoes were sent from Gaza to Jordan. Well, it means that they're exporting produce, and the Jordanians refused to take it. They refused to let it into the country. So the question is, why blame Israel when Israel allows export of such products?
Are you aware of what the Palestinian leadership is responding on this move to impose sanctions on Israel? You know, there are various bits and pieces, and some of the news are saying that unnamed sources from the PLO leadership are against this and have criticized it. Have you heard anything along those lines?
Yes, I have, and indeed, some of the leadership in the Palestinian Authority are business partners or are involved with Israeli companies. Their sons are involved in some high-tech companies. But they also view this as a solidarity movement with them, and they're not going to tell people, stop this. But it is well known that a very senior Palestinian leader, his sons helped build this separation wall that the BDS movement is so strongly against. We see this type of activity. Indeed, on the daily life out in the West Bank between Jews and Palestinians, I'd say 95% of the interactions are very friendly. There are stores that are opening. The Fox clothing store was supposed to open in Ramallah in the Arab territory. Fox is owned by an Israeli company. And a minority of protesters are demanding that it be closed down. So cooperation can, and I believe will work. Generally, the BDS movement is not led by Palestinians in the West Bank. It's led by radical left and, in some cases, Islamic right wing who want to stop any such cooperation.
Lenny, I just want to thank you so much for joining us on today's programme on the Middle East Report from Jerusalem. So thank you for joining us, and Shabbat Shalom to you.
Thank you very much, and to your audience too. Bye.
Thank you. And Zalmi, I just want to ask you the kind of leading question really of the programme is that what gives the EU the moral authority and right to actually impose a situation upon Israel, knowing Europe's horrendous track record on the treatment of the Jewish people, particularly if we go back 70 years and look at Europe's involvement really in the Holocaust, which resulted in over 6 million Jewish people losing their lives at the hands of the Nazis.
Well, of course, it's immoral. All of this is totally immoral, and as our friend from Israel was just saying, that this is driven by radical leftist agendas and anti-Semitic agendas, mixed with right-wing, seriously, rabidly anti-Jewish Islamic fundamentalists, and they've formed this nexus which is driving and funding these NGOs, and then feeding into what I've referred to as the planet's biggest NGO. There's no morality in this at all. Basically, it's reminiscent of 1933 Nazi Germany, when they brought in the closing of boycotting of Jewish shops. Kauf nicht hier, don't buy here. And that was 1933. And just 2 years later, there were the Nuremberg laws. So can we expect something more draconian from Mrs. Ashton, the unelected head of the European superstate foreign ministry, in 2 years' time? Perhaps that Jews may not be able to marry into various European families and so forth. Is it going to become even worse than that? I think the European Union has gotten into bed with some very, very nasty characters, and it needs to clean out its stable, because morality ain't there.
And Robin, I mean, majority of our audience is a Christian audience watching today's programme. Yeah. And we know very well from Genesis chapter 12, verse 13, that God promises those that he will bless those who bless Israel and curse those who curse Israel. Yes. I mean, what are the spiritual implications for Europe if they go ahead and actually pursue this policy of imposing economic sanctions upon Israel, which is the biblical heartland of Israel?
Well, I would think, Simon, actually there are those who would say, and I've got a very, very strong degree of sympathy with them, that the European Union is already under God's judgment. Many would say that the whole financial mess is evidence of God arising, the God of the Bible, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Israel, arising in defense of his people and beginning to judge the European Union and its institutions. We have, people say it's global warming and all the rest of it, fine. But God, we believe in a sovereign God, so he is in charge of every aspect of human life of this planet. And I think there probably are those who would say that this continued weird weather that the world in general has been experiencing for the last few years is possibly another evidence of God arising in judgment on the nations for the way that they've treated the Jewish people. And, particularly as anti-Semitism, as, radical anti-Semitism that is actually seeing attacks in some places almost on a weekly basis, much of it unreported in the general media, on Jewish populations in certain parts of Europe and Scandinavia. And the Lord is not pleased, and therefore Genesis 12, 1-3 is really coming into play, is really coming into action. And if the personally speaking, I think if the EU continues down the track, we hope that sense will be seen by those who have instigated this. But if the EU really pursues this track of harsher and harsher measures against Israel and the Jewish people, then there will be more and more problems for the European Union and its nations.
Yeah, and Zalmi, you want to add something?
Yeah, when you talk about curses and in a biblical sense, I'm reminded of Balaam,
Yeah.
because when he was asked to curse by Balak,
Yeah.
the Jewish people, it says, and he got up early in the morning and he saddled his donkey.
Yeah.
He saddled his own donkey. He was one of the most famous people. He didn't have to saddle his donkey. And anti-Semites, when they start, when they want to do their work, they're very fast to do it. I mentioned, 1933, 1935, a very quick transition. And that really makes me think, Israel was taken by surprise by this directive. Israel is never taken by surprise. Maybe the Yom Kippur War it was. So how does a group of countries, of 28 countries, which ordinarily works with glacial slowness, come up overnight with this bombshell? These are the hallmarks of a determined effort to undermine, delegitimize, demonize, and double standardize the Jewish nation, and singled out for that purpose. And I think you never seen any action in 3 years in Syria by this whole band of 28 nations to stop the slaughter of 100,000 people. But if somebody builds a granny flat in Jerusalem, Baroness Ashton is on our case.
Yeah.
Crazy, isn't it? We've got a clip to go to now that goes some way to explaining EU's hostility towards the Jewish state of Israel.
Did you ever wonder why only one country in the world, Israel, is considered by many in the international community to be illegitimate? By illegitimate, I mean that it literally has no legal right to exist. Here's Richard Falk, Princeton University professor of international law and former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in the Palestinian territories, describing and presumably justifying the movement to delegitimize Israel. The essence of this legitimacy war is to cast doubt on Israel's status as a moral and law-abiding actor, to deny it rights as a member of international society. It is up to all of us dedicated to peace and justice to do all we can to help the Palestinians prevail in the legitimacy war and to bring their long ordeal to an end. Think about this for a moment. Nobody questions whether Zimbabwe has a right to exist, or Suriname, or Pakistan, a country whose founding in 1948, the same year modern Israel was founded, created about 12 million refugees and brought about the deaths of nearly 1 million people, nearly all civilians. Why then is Israel singled out? Is it really because of the interminable Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Israel's continued occupation of land that it conquered in self-defense in 1967 when its Arab neighbors tried to annihilate it? If occupation were the reason, why the attempted annihilation of Israel before there was any occupation? And if occupation were the reason, why did Israel's isolation increase after Israel offered to give virtually all of that land to the Palestinians in 2000, and after Israel withdrew completely from the Gaza Strip in 2005? And besides, there are interminable conflicts all over the globe, and much bloodier ones too. No, the reason for the world's antagonism to Israel goes much deeper than that. Many in the international community, especially Europe, are actually opposed to the idea of a Jewish state. Why? The answers are complex, but I want to isolate one that is very important and almost always ignored. After 2 world wars in Europe, Europe's leaders and intellectual elite decided that the nation state was a terrible idea. Look at the carnage it had created, they argued. A much better idea would be to erase borders, unified currency, and downplay national identities. The plan was to transcend the nation state, replace it with something better. This would be a pan-European entity, what is now known as the European Union. Ironically, at that very same time, the Jews drew precisely the opposite conclusion. Now, the Jews said, having suffered centuries of persecution and the murder of 6 million of us in this century, what we need more than ever is a state of our own, for our culture, for our traditions, for our safety, a place of our own where we are responsible for our own future. Even before Israel declared its independence in May 1948, The collision between Israel and Europe was therefore inevitable. Europe wanted to move away from the nation-state. The Jews wanted to move toward it. The Jews' desire for a state of their own, which we know by the term Zionism, Zion being a biblical name for Israel, is hardly surprising. It's been a part of Jewish prayer and ritual ever since the Jews were expelled from their homeland, first by the Babylonians in 586 BC, and finally by the Romans in the year 135. Indeed, for 2,000 years, the Jewish Passover meal has ended with the phrase, "next year" in Jerusalem. But in remaking their own state, the Jewish people aroused jealousy and anger in both Europe and the Arab world. Nothing is more difficult for human beings than the experience of watching others acquire what we are in the process of losing. Europe's elites knew that unifying all of Europe would come at a heavy cost of culture, language, tradition, the things that made them who they are. But they forged ahead anyway, anything to prevent another war, they reasoned, all while watching the Jewish people recover its borders, its language, and its heritage. Meanwhile, the Arab world, forced to face the fact that it had never invested in the institutions of a liberal democracy, a free press, the right of association, women's rights, and the like, turned its frustration on the Jewish state, because the Jewish state was doing what they couldn't do. What do the European and Arab worlds have in common? Instead of acknowledging what Israel has accomplished, they increasingly repudiate it. The Arab and much of the Muslim world seek to destroy Israel, while too much of Europe enables that goal by delegitimizing the idea upon which Israel is built, the making of a distinctive Jewish nation called Israel.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report. Zalmi, I think we can be very proud of the incredible achievements of the Jewish state in such a short period of time, in terms of economic development, in terms of agriculture, in terms of really being a beacon of light and a democracy in the Middle East. And surely it comes down that Europe should actually be united with Europe in the challenges that Europe and Israel face from the rise of Islamic extremism, also the problem of food shortages, economic problems, that Europe and Israel have more in common than Europe has with, say, Iran or the Muslim Brotherhood. And in response to these economic sanctions that look like going to be imposed upon Israel, how should we respond to this challenge of the European Union?
How should we? When you say we, you mean Christians? Do you mean how should Israel respond?
Both the Christians and also the Jewish people as well in this country respond to this.
I think that my reaction, I think our reaction would be that we can seeing is believing. You look at Israel today, and you see a country that is truly blessed, except the way it's portrayed in the press. But anyone who's been, and you've been, it's truly blessed. In terms of its agriculture, in terms of its culture, in terms of its academic achievements, in terms of its high tech, in terms of the inflows of capital into the country, and all of its wonderful, the prizes that it's obtained in the world, it's truly blessed. And then you look at Europe, which is crumbling into this mire of multicultural decay. And I think you're quite right in terms of, it almost looks as if it's been cursed for what it's been doing. So I actually do buy into that. And I think Israel's answer should be to continue what it's been doing all along, just pursuing its own agenda. And, countries are going to be needing stuff that Israel produces, whether it's the innovations for irrigation in the third world countries, or whether it's virus control for computers and cell phones and microchips and so forth in their computers. And no manner of boycotts is going to stop that. What I think Israel needs to do is to put the quartet very much in a new light now, because the quartet is the United Nations, which is grossly anti-Israel. It is Russia, which is placing missiles into Syria. And now we have the EU. 3 out of the 4 have shown themselves to be grossly anti-Israel and siding with the Islamic fundamentalists. And that leaves just the United States. So I think after a move like this from the EU, the best answer for Israel would be to focus its attentions solely on the Congress, which is the United States Congress, which is solidly behind Israel and which has solidly shown itself to be fully supportive of even more draconian sanctions against Iran just in the last few days. And we should very strongly state, we will treat with the United States as the sole legitimate arbitrator and arbiter in this dispute. And we're not interested in hearing from the rest of you in the quartet.
Yeah. And Robin, how should our Christian viewers respond to this? Should they be worried about this latest EU proposal to impose economic sanctions upon Israel beyond the Green Line, such as in Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and also Judea Samaria, which is the biblical heartland of Israel?
Yeah, I mean, of course, as Christians, we should definitely be very concerned. And we need to be doing something about it as well, rather than just sitting back and letting it happen. And I just jotted down 4 things. People can pray. I mean, that is, as Christians, that is our primary weapon, in inverted commas. We need to pray for Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government, his cabinet, how they react to this situation. We need to pray for God's mercy on our nation and on the European Union, and that clear heads will prevail and that there'll be a backtracking on this crazy proposal. But then the second thing is that folk need to stay informed. They need to be aware of what is going on. And I don't care where people get their information, whether it's from CFI or from some of the other organizations. Get it and be informed so that you can pray intelligently. But then buy Israeli goods. Prove the boycotters wrong by buying Israeli goods wherever you can find them. Go buy them. I'm not going to name store names because we're not here to advertise any particular chains, but you probably know where they are, so go do it. And fourthly, you need to think about writing to your MEP. And if you don't know who your MEP is, then find out who your member of parliament is in the European Union and write to them and make sure that they're aware of the fact that you don't agree with this move. And as a side to that, you could also get involved in supporting another Christian ministry called the European Coalition for Israel, ECI.org. Go find out what they're doing at the European Union and the UN and get involved. We cannot afford as Christians, pardon the expression, to sit on our bums and not do something about situations like this, because we will have to answer before the God of Israel for not being active in support of the Jewish people at this crucial time in the history of this small nation as it is surrounded by this sea of hatred in the Middle East.
Very good. I'm impressed. I absolutely agree with your sentiments entirely there, Robin, that we do really need to kind of rally the call. But Zalmi, one thing we're seeing over the last 10 years really is kind of that breakdown of the wall between Christians and Jews. And, we're coming together as a force that signifies our worship to the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, but also as a means to actually thank the Jewish people for the entire heritage that we have. And maybe Europe has to remember that her heritage, which is our Judean Christian heritage, is thanks to the Jewish people.
Yes, I mean, Jews are the canary in the coal mine of civilization. What started with the Jews ends up with everybody else. Yeah. And I think it's very, very important that we understand that whilst we are a very, very small part of the world, we're 1/10 of 1% of the world's population are Jews. The Christians are massive, but seem to be totally silent, too silent, while Christians in Africa and so forth are being slaughtered, and no one says a word. And I think it needs to become more vocal.
Yeah, I agree. No, very much so.
Absolutely, because I believe that we are in very, very troubled times, and I think one thing we have to really do is actually to speak up. And we know that the Jewish community, particularly in Europe, are particularly frightened at this time in world history. As we see a rise of anti-Semitism across Europe. We see the rise of the far right in Hungary and in Greece. In France alone, there have been numerous attacks on the Jewish community. And the Jewish community is scared in Europe. Isn't it time that, that Christians and others got together, those who love freedom, those who love democracy, and start defending the only real true beacon of light in the Middle East, which is Israel?
I think the Christian organizations are probably the biggest silent majority on the planet today, and they need to find their voice.
Gentlemen, I just want to thank you so much for being my guests on today's Middle East Report. It's a pleasure to have you, Robin, and also Zalmi on the programme today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you all for watching today's programme. Today we discussed the EU's proposal to put in place economic sanctions against Israeli goods and services that are produced in Judea and Samaria. And let's remember, this is the biblical heartland of the Jewish people, including Jerusalem and also the Golan Heights, which makes incredible wine, and it's Israel's wine-producing region. Let's fight these boycotters. Let's buy more Israeli goods. Let's stand up for Israel more. But let's also make a difference by contacting our MEPs, members of the European Parliament, and also our MPs to actually tell them that this is wrong, that the direction of the European Union is wrong. It will bring a curse upon Europe and the people of Europe, and it's time that we stood up and made a difference. It's our time to really fight and stand with Israel and the Jewish people. So we want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report, and hopefully you've actually learned something and you go and do something. So thank you for watching today's programme.